Hi everyone, Borna here from Workpuls. I'm here with Amie Devero. Did I do it right?
Devero.
Devero,
No,
sorry.
Amie Devero.
Devero, sorry about that again. So she's a managing director of Beyond Better, but she's also an executive and personal coach and a management consultant. We are here today in Workpuls Productivity Talks to discuss productivity, of course, to learn a little bit more about Amie and what she's doing and how she's helping companies increase productivity, but also for her to share some tips with all of us on how can we all increase our own productivity or help our teams increase their productivity. So let's start off. You can tell us first a little bit about what it is that you do, what kind of services do you provide, and then we can move on from there.
Sure. So Beyond Better is a strategy consulting primarily and executive coaching firm. And I work primarily, not entirely, but primarily with high growth tech startup companies, but not like early stage startup, those that already have sort of Series A or Series B. And so they're in the process of scaling a team and making that transition from being a tiny little intimate family, if you will, to being an enterprise. And the reason that I think that I actually ended up, doing this with you is because one of the things that becomes a bigger and bigger problem as companies grow is the demands on the leadership for their time. And so they're really, really challenged by how to be able to meet all of those demands while also attending to their teams, but not failing to do the important and deep work necessary to execute the strategies, which is what I work with them on the consulting side. And so that's kind of what I do. And most of my coaching clients are those founders or executive teams, leaders, boards of directors of those companies. And then the consulting work is done with those teams, but then is executed throughout the organization. So there's a strategy piece, a measurement piece, and a culture piece. And productivity has a role in all of that.
Yes, that's definitely true. But so you mainly work with in the software industry, in the IT industry, but I've seen you also been doing in different industries with teams of different sizes. And would you say that there is some kind of a productivity increasing tip that could be a one size fits all, or it's a tailored approach for every one of them? Is there anything, are there any universal tips everyone can adapt to their company, or it's just a matter of trial and error and trying out different things?
There are universal tips, but they're not universally embraced. Mm-hmm. So, the truth is that there are certain best practices that it would be great if all organizations did them. But there's a lot of variation in how much you can expect either an organization to flex, or if you're not the very top leader, you're limited in how much impact you have on what the expectations are for you as an employee. So, for example, if one of the things that I recommend that people surrender completely to their calendars and utilize their calendars as their to-do list, but not just as a list. So they actually allocate specific durations of time for specific activities like working on projects or writing content or coding new development, and a lot of all of these recommendations dovetail with the kinds of software that teams use, like Trello and all of the software they would utilize to execute a Scrum sprint and so on and so forth. But the truth is, if you have a boss who constantly interrupts you and makes impromptu demands, then your calendar efforts get interrupted constantly, which means your train of thought gets interrupted, which means your productivity gets essentially eroded. And so the tips are the same, but the degree to which they can be implemented is not.
Oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. Yeah, you mentioned that in your when we first spoke via email, the surrender to your calendar tip. As I could understand, it's sort of like time blocking.
Mm-hmm. Or it is. Yeah. Time blocking is a crucial part of it. Yeah, time blocking
Yeah,
is
I mean,
fundamental.
mhm, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to ask, like, how would you define productivity? What would you say that productivity is, actually?
I would say that productivity is having a correlation between how you use the time that you have and how you accomplish the the things that you want to do. So, for most people, it's not a strong correlation. They mean to do a lot of things, but their time gets eaten up in a way that isn't conscious. It's not deliberate. It's not a match between what they think is most important, what they're most committed to and most concerned about, and what the time gets used for. In fact, it's not unusual for me when I first begin working with a founder or a leader or really anyone to say, let's look at your calendar for next Wednesday. And if they don't have specific appointments with other human beings, there's nothing on their calendar. Like the calendar has nothing in it, which means that the day will get completely consumed with reaction, or it'll get consumed with things that are a function of recency bias, like the thing you thought of yesterday that you should do, instead of the thing that's going to make the biggest difference to the organization.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I get that. I still haven't tried time blocking. I've been promising to myself that I will. And just as you said now, that they have nothing except meetings with other human beings in their calendars. It's the same for me. I have nothing besides meetings in my calendars. I have my tasks in Trello, and I have deadlines there and notifications there. But yeah, it sounds like it's a more efficient technique to have everything in the calendars. Maybe the quarantine is a good place to start and test out that to see how it will work for me.
Well, I'll share something with you. It's more than just for productivity. I mean, there's a psychological or cognitive component in this that's really important. So if you think about the demands on a typical founder of a company or a leader in a very fast growing company, they are constantly thinking of things they need to do, things they ought to do, things they want to make sure they don't forget to do. And that constant tirade in our brains demands cognitive horsepower. So if you imagine your brain has a certain amount of energy and horsepower, and then you are allowing that horsepower and energy to be cannibalized by what is essentially a completely unnecessary thing, which is worrying and wondering and hoping and meaning and anxiety about, oh my gosh, I might forget to do that, then anything you can do to reduce that anxiety means productivity goes up, because cognitive bandwidth is, all of it is available instead of just a part of it. And so the reason that I say to surrender to your calendar and to time block everything you mean to do is because if you have surrendered to your calendar and you know that you're going to do what's on your calendar, and then you take all that stuff in your brain and you put it in the calendar, you can stop worrying. Like it literally eliminates all of that background noise. So now all you have to focus on is what's the next thing on my calendar. And you just do that.
Okay, and what happens, like, this is it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that this is more of a tip for individuals. Like you can go ahead and tell that to the founder. The founder can try and do that with his employees. But what will be the first thing that employers or managers or team leaders could do if they want to increase productivity in their workplace?
So the way that you do this in an organization is, obviously it's great if individuals do that, but as I said, if the culture of the company is one that doesn't respect the calendar, then what needs to happen is a culture shift. So if I talk to a founder and I'm talking to them about this kind of a culture shift, I'm not talking about necessarily what they do. I'm talking about the way that you could implement that at an enterprise level. And so it requires some very specific principles, like that while people's calendars are available and visible to each other, that when somebody actually blocks out a chunk of time for something, and they, regardless of what it is, unless there's something emergent that needs to supersede that, people don't sort of cannibalize their time. And it doesn't work all the time, because there are organizations where they have a culture of what I would consider to be boundaryless scheduling on other people's calendars. So I have one CTO client of a very large, I mean, they call it a startup, but it's not really a startup, it's huge. And, you know, his time gets completely eaten up by other people putting him in meetings. And, you know, so there are a lot of sort of subordinate rules that go with this, like have the fewest possible number of people in a meeting. The only people who should be in a meeting are the ones who are extremely consequentially important to making whatever decision that meeting is meant to produce. Meetings should have an agenda and a specific outcome. Even if the outcome is we're going to come up with 10 ideas for something, then you have the agenda, you have the outcome, and then you really very rigorously select who's in the meeting, and you can make other people optional. So if they feel like they could contribute a great deal and they have the space in their calendar, great, they are included. Or you can create a process where you say, these people are optional, but listen, if you can't make it to the meeting, we're going to send out a summary after the meeting. So you can carry on with what you need to do, what's on your calendar, believing and understanding that you will not be left out of this, but you're being left out of the meeting for your own, you know, state of mind, really. So these are sort of company-wide principles and practices that can make it possible for everybody in the organization to get their calendar respected, their time blocking respected, and to not have their entire day eaten up with important but not, well, I'd say urgent but not important activities.
Okay, and in your experience, what do you think, how long does it take for a company, let's say between 50 and 100 people, to implement a thing like that, to make that culture shift and to actually start respecting the calendar and time blocking for everyone?
I'll tell you something, it depends entirely on how committed the leadership is. I mean, that really isn't there's no right answer to that. A leader who's truly committed and surrenders to this kind of a process can make it happen in 2 weeks, you know, by simply, you know, issuing a fiat, this is how we're going to do it, and it's going to start with me. I'm going to be the first one who stops, you know, basically stealing other people's time. And the way we're going to, and a software like you guys produce would be really effective in incentivizing people to stick with it, because if people are not just in meetings all the time or having what are essentially inconsequential interruptions, they will be doing the things that you're tracking. And that will mean amped results for the organization. It also means people will be able to focus, because important work doesn't get done without real focus. And if the focus is broken every few minutes or every 25 minutes or every 30 minutes or whatever it is, or for every email that comes in and every Slack message that comes in, and I mean, if you are constantly bombarded by all of these interruptions in your mental focus, you're less productive. You're unable to produce the most important work that the organization needs from you.
Okay, and we're obviously right now we are in a weird time. We're working from home. Some people have already worked from home. A lot of companies nowadays, especially in the IT industry, have been remote since their beginning, and they were sort of the first ones who really embraced the remote culture and started working that way. Right now, how does do you think that I'm not sure if you're still working, you're still consulting, I guess, even during this time. How does it work in this environment? The time
it's probably in some ways easier in this environment, because you don't have a door where people can just walk in, or a desk where somebody can just walk up to you and interrupt you. You know, there are some kind of basic work hygiene things that make this easier to do even when you're remote. So for example, while I tell people to turn off their email alert and not respond to every email as it comes in, not even read it, I also tell them, though, to set specific times of day when they will do. And if you can implement this at a company-wide level, then you can actually keep Slack going or keep text going, because people have internalize the message that we're only reaching out to you if it's important. We are not trivially reaching out to you for nothing. So if you're checking your email, let's say every 2 hours, then that's not an unreasonable amount of time to expect people to, to expect a response. And if you are publishing your calendar, then people know where the breaks are, where the gaps are, and when they can reach out to you. The other thing is that while we're working at home, it's really important for leaders to ensure that they don't kind of let people, like sort of not provide to people the kind of support they need to be productive. And that may mean that people need to go walk the dog in the middle of the day just to have a mental break, because they don't have the break room and they don't have the ability to, do the things that normally break up our focus in the course of a working day. They'd give our brains a break and allow us to shift what our cognitive function is doing at that moment. So you need to provide that, which means you need to provide an opportunity for people to hang out and just chat, or to get away from the screen and do something else. And if leaders don't say that, workers won't do it because they'll be afraid of appearing not to be working.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that depends on the culture as well in general. Right. What was the culture in the office and what's the culture right now? It sort of gets transferred from the office into our homes. And if we at work, I feel like in the office, if we felt like that we can only go out on a break if it's, I don't know, if what's happening, or go for lunch and maybe go on one other break. But if we have that environment, we can take breaks more frequently. Because we finished what we were doing, or we just need a couple of minutes to rest from the screen and go outside. And I think that also transfers into our homes when we're working. So we still feel...
It does, but it's not a perfect transfer, because imagine you're in an office and you see somebody go to the kitchen to get a cup of tea. As the worker, you don't necessarily feel like you're slacking off, right? Because your boss is in the building and can see that you're getting a cup of tea and you're in the office, you're just, it's obvious. But if you try to translate that to the home environment, all the boss would see is nobody on that screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that leaves a lot to the imagination, right? Did he just go to the bathroom? Did he just leave and, go for a jog? Like there's a lot of latitude for imagination. And so obviously the culture translates to a large extent, but I don't think it's a perfect transfer. And enterprises in which people are very autonomous, which is most of my clients, it's actually even harder, because the leadership is used to people working on their own and being completely self-sufficient, which means that if they are suffering, struggling, lonely, bored, finding it difficult to focus, worried about their grandma who's in a nursing home, and the boss doesn't proactively sort of reach out and say something about that, then the quality of work will suffer.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, again, it all comes back to the communication within the team and within the leadership and the team members, and how it all goes from there. Tell me this. What are some of the things, or some of the tips you would have for managers and leaders who decided that they want to introduce a technique such as time blocking to their company, and to introduce it to themselves and their teams? Like, what would be some tips on how to make it possible and how to make it as successful as possible?
So there are some things that you can do. For example, let's imagine that I'm a leader and I convene a meeting and we're going to start some kind of a new project, right? One of the things you can do to encourage people to utilize time blocking to do that would be right there in the meeting, have everybody take out their phones or their laptops or whatever they have with them, and block the time over, let's say, the next 4 weeks to accomplish this project. So that you're not just saying we're going to do time blocking, you're actually providing the leadership and guidance on how to use it and when to use it. So you're not going to tell people which hours to block, but you're going to say, all right, let's estimate how many hours of work this is going to take. We want to have it done by September. Let's back into our calendars and all block out the time to do that. And that way you begin this kind of way of thinking, because it's a very different way of thinking. And one of the things that people really need urgently to change when they start thinking about time blocking is they need to greatly expand their horizon on their calendar. We tend only to ever think about the next 2 weeks. Even sprints are 2 weeks, right? So, but the truth is, if you're going to accomplish significant, profound projects, they need to take longer. They will take longer than that. They may take 6 months. And if a leader doesn't necessarily model that behavior and encourage that behavior and guide people about how to do that, how to go out 6 months to a deadline, work back, block the time so that you have ensured the progress of the project, it won't happen. Another thing that leaders can do is they can encourage people to block out time for specific projects and specifically say, please turn off your alerts for email. If I have an urgent need, I will call you on the telephone. It sounds so insignificant, but we don't use our phones very much these days for telephone calls, which means that if you designate telephone calls as the way to interrupt somebody and say, we're only going to do this when we really need somebody right now, and we can't wait for that 2-hour window for a response, then when the phone rings, it's an apt interruption. And so the boss can train people in that and say, everybody's going to have their alerts off, so don't expect instant response.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are a couple tips that I think are really useful.
Yeah, I like that blocking of notifications. I think that my email notifications are blocked all the time. My email is open in one of the tabs always, but I really stopped going to it and checking it. I'm not the person on the team that actually gets a lot of emails. On a company-wide level, we communicate through Slack. We're a small company, so we can still afford to do everything we need to do through Slack. And I just know that like sometimes it would happen that I even just like go and shut off Slack notifications because I want to get this done. I want to sit down and write the article without having any interruptions. We're jumping around different tabs or whatever, and just like shut down Slack notifications. And I found that that's a very simple thing. As you said, it seems so insignificant, but it actually helps a lot because we have no idea something's going to happen. Somebody's going to send a message in a random chat, just something funny as a joke.
Right.
And then my mind will wander off and I'll start talking to some people, or I start like browsing through something else online. And it's just, it's so small, but it can do so much. It's really incredible.
Yeah. And imagine if you just only checked Slack, 5 times a day and had it off, gone.
Yeah.
I mean, I am an enemy of Slack because I think it is a recipe for constant interruption and a complete lack of concentration. Because even if you're not actively checking Slack, the awareness that it's there and that something could be happening is distracting. It keeps you from the kind of focus necessary.
Yeah. I guess. I mean, it's like that with any instant messaging app. It's not like we have anything against Slack specifically. It's any instant messaging app would have the same effect on people. Okay. Well, I think we've covered everything that I've wanted to cover on my end. I don't know if there's maybe anything that you wanted to share regarding productivity or time blocking that we haven't mentioned yet.
No, I mean, I think, I'm sure you'll hear other tips from other people. And I do think, though, that maybe the unique thing that I think is really important is the degree to which leaders need to be the catalyst for this kind of a change. Because I see a lot of individuals and organizations really struggling with having their own, their sort of own individual culture of productivity. And when it's in competition with what the organization is doing, it might not be an epic failure, but it's a somewhat of a failure. And it's really to the benefit of an entire organization to make it possible for people to work with this kind of focus and energy.
So it's definitely something of a lead by example sort of thing in this case.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, well, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. It was lovely meeting you and discussing all this. And thank you everyone for listening. And we'll be back with another Productivity Talks episode of Workpuls.